So I'm hoping there's not too much of a noise problem. I'm actually doing this simultaneously with them replacing like a gas line outside, so hopefully none of that comes through too much, because I've put off doing this video long enough, so we're just going to have to roll with it. Um, Obviously the idea was always to go with Love Actually. The question was, whatever would I do with it? And for a while there, the only things that really came to mind were the similar Gary Marshall movies, like Valentine's Day or New Year's Eve or whatever, where it's the intersecting stories, mostly romantic, centered around a particular holiday. But then I said, fuck that, because who cares? And then I remembered Playing by Heart, and it's sort of that similar, the whole intersecting stories thing, and they all sort of have a connection. Probably a bigger connection, probably in Playing by Heart than any of the other movies I've mentioned, because they all kind of come together at once, but obviously Love Actually kind of set the standard for this sort of, Magnolia-esque romantic comedy. So, despite the fact that Playing by Heart was all the way back in '98 and Love Actually wouldn't be till 2004, Playing by Heart even predating Magnolia, despite the fact that I use that as the ultimate example of this style. But, so, yeah. So I think we'll obviously start with Love Actually, which comes from Richard Curtis, whose name probably sounds familiar if you've seen any British romantic comedy, whether it be Bridget Jones or Four Weddings and a Funeral or Notting Hill. And this was, I believe, his first time actually directing a movie. Also, one of his own scripts or a movie ever. And you'll see that the cast lists sort of tend to mix together as well. So one sort of argument that's often seen about this movie is in regards to whether it's like a typical romantic comedy in some senses, like maybe it's a bit too cliche in some ways, or he wanted to seem like he was hitting certain story points despite some other creative directions he goes in this and has gone in the past with the romantic comedy genre. But the argument to that typically is it was him sort of looking at romantic comedies in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, so anytime he does something that might seem a bit cliche or a bit typical romantic comedy, it's on purpose for a specific reason, to sort of almost call it out in a sense. I'm not really sure. I can sort of see that in both ways, and I feel like he's a smart enough writer that it's very easy to buy it's some sort of satirical look a bit, or maybe also just a loving embrace of it, which could be the case too. Like maybe he did go in those directions, unironically, just for a love of what the genre can do, even if sometimes it might seem a bit cliche or a bit obvious. So one of the characters that immediately stands out here, because we'd be here all day if we went through all the characters of both of these movies, but just to call out a certain few, obviously the Hugh Grant character, the Prime Minister, really stands out in how is because we obviously have seen him doing the romantic comedy thing since probably Four Weddings might have been the first, if I'm mistaken, because he was mostly in like the Merchant Ivory movies prior to that. Which of course he was really funny and charming in, and then there was Notting Hill and all that. Even I think even his more American romantic comedies like 2 Weeks Notice were like a couple years before this, and he sort of really established himself here as somebody that he sort of became one of the faces of the genre, but there was always something that felt sort of fresh in regards to what he would bring to them. And this character is no different from that. If anything, this character is like one of the prime examples of how he was able to pull that off. Especially when he first meets his love interest. I've seen this movie so many times, but I'm going to forget a number of character names because there's just so many to keep up with. And the thing is that we have this typical romantic comedy moment where pretty much the second he meets her and they make eye contact, regardless of his, much greater position of just about everybody around him, there's going to be just this really simple connection between them just through this small exchange of words and profanities. And the thing is, and the special thing about that is just how instantly we feel the connection, and both of them do at the same time. It's one of those things that would feel like very contrived if it wasn't done well enough. But both their performances and the writing just feel so natural, like instantaneously, that it just, like the second that is established, there are two of the characters that you kind of can't wait to see come back around in the whole story. So, and the fact that they're able to do that in like one moment, when a lot of the bad romantic comedies can't seem to establish that kind of connection in their entire movie. The fact that this does it in the first scene when they've got so many other stories going on also is kind of a feat in itself. And another thing that Hugh Grant seems to really bring to this is he's sort of got a vibe in regards to how he can be that sort of, a bit of a stoic type, but also, like, he can also go to silly lengths if he has to, but also is the perfect romantic lead. Kind of reminds you of a classic actor with the same last name as him, and the way that he's able to do that too without it, but also feeling like kind of his own thing. Because that's another thing that Hugh Grant kind of has going for him is I could see him being accused of being one of those actors where his characters sort of feel the same. But even if that is the case, the character that he's created is just so charming that I would definitely watch all this stuff that he does and all these other stories, even if the characters may feel slightly the same, there's still something else there in each different character. So that's a part of it I've always appreciated. And even the moment where, like, the way he establishes, like, how not only is he Hugh Grant and he looks like Hugh Grant and he's playing this character that's in this big position of power, how we can still have moments like when he walks by her and he does, like, the smile and the two-handed wave that he immediately realizes was idiotic. And just sort of relatable moments like that to a character that should feel almost like anything but relatable given the position that he's in. It just really adds to how real the characters feel regardless of where they're coming from. And I think that's something that he also is a credit to him, but also in the direction and the writing and all that too. So there is that. Another section that sort of stands out is, well, I guess we can go right into his sister, Emma Thompson, who sort of adds an interesting balance to the movie, because obviously there's going to be, it's a nice romantic comedy on one side, but there's also quite a bit of drama in it also, and sometimes they sort of balance that together. And for a while, it seems like they're sort of giving Emma Thompson the shit end of the stick, because she's basically just working as this really obvious exposition machine in this really weird way that none of the other characters in the movie are really acting like. It's, like, solely her character. Like, they do start off with it doing kind of a funny thing with it when she's on the phone with Liam Neeson and they're talking, and she says, like, oh yeah, but I don't want it to sound like I don't care that your wife just died. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a pretty blatant way to just tell us what's going on, and sort of unnatural. But the way she sort of, like, catches herself, like, saying something, like, tactlessly, is sort of funny about that. But then the way it goes on also when, like, she blatantly has to refer to Hugh Grant as her brother, despite the fact that we've pretty much figured that out. And also when the first time we see her in a scene with Alan Rickman, she just blatantly refers to herself as his wife. And it just really seems like this spell everything out for the audience sort of way that we don't really need. And like I said, it's so weird that it seems like solely her character that has dialogue like this. But they do manage to work past that, especially the more they give her character, particularly with this affair subplot with Rickman, where apparently it was debated for a long time. That says something about the status of the movie also, that, like, years after the fact, people are still debating some of the things that go on here. And I guess it was Richard Curtis's wife that finally confirmed that it was, because I guess there was a debate about whether or not Rickman and his coworker had, like, a full-on affair, or if it was just the flirty thing that ended with him giving her the necklace. But apparently Richard Curtis says that it was, in fact, like a full-on physical affair and all that, and the whole thing of did they stay together or did they not, which is sort of nicely ambiguous at the end, but apparently they just sort of blew the cover off that and says that they did. It just wasn't, it's just shaky now. So I'm really interested. I was thinking they were going to do, when they did the Red Nose Day reunion thing, but it was because it would be without Alan Rickman. Emma Thompson decided she wasn't going to do it at all either, so we never really, I never, like, saw that thing or anything, but I'm under the impression we never even went in that direction, so it's just sort of left as we know it now. So, but the thing about that, though, is that there's still all these things about how heartwarming the movie can be in some of these moments, and just how equally heartbreaking it could be, particularly the big reveal when we realize that Emma Thompson is getting the Joni Mitchell CD instead of the necklace, and she realizes quickly what has happened here. And it is one of those cases where it does, like, I keep kind of forgetting, because you see the movie enough times, and you're so aware of what's going on, you kind of forget how it was initially revealed, and how there was, like, this sort of, we kind of assumed during the first Rowan Atkinson scene that the necklace is for her, and that's why he's being secretive, but then as it really goes in that direction, the content of his character really starts to come out. But still, also what Rickman does here also is to make the dude, like, they could have gone just full on, made this guy, like, despicable and heartless and all that, but they do make the direction he goes feel, if exactly we don't like the direction his character goes, it still feels real and like something a real person would do, and not just for the contrivance of a screenplay, which is obviously a trap that a lot of romantic comedies fall into. So the pairing of the two of them alone was going to always make this work, but obviously the execution and the writing certainly help also. Then there's the interesting case of Liam Neeson, which is another really good portion of this movie for a number of reasons, starting with the unavoidable thing here, where it's this eerie scenario of watching Liam Neeson at his wife's funeral 5 years before this would happen to him for real. And it sort of just has this sort of now eerie yet heartbreaking tone. Like, eerie makes it sound like a little more morbid, but certainly heartbreaking angle to see, knowing where Neeson would go in real life in this storyline and how real his performance already feels, let alone how it might have if this role had come to him after the fact. But still, he sort of kind of got to show that off with The Grey, but here it would have been. Once again, I hate to almost be too light in discussing it, but almost like you'd be really interested to see what that would be like, regardless. But the other thing that makes this story really effective is it would have been really easy to make it a story about a father and son after the mother and wife has died, and how they basically get along, especially with the kid falling in love and all that. Where Neeson's sort of like at the end of this great love in his life, and this kid's just attempting to just begin one. But I really like that there's that just extra layer to it, that they're not father and son, but stepfather and son. So it's like, to see these two characters together is probably even more heartwarming than if they had directly been father and son, because it's like, when you have that sort of relationship, there's already, like, some work has had to be done to get to this point to where they basically see each other as father and son with no, maybe just the fact that they're not blood related coming between it at all. So it's like how they must have established that relationship on top of what would happen afterwards and how they deal with that together. Just sort of adds that extra layer to it that maybe wouldn't have been there if they were just typical father and son. So I really like that particular detail, which seems like so small, but really makes it feel so different when you look at it from that perspective. And then, of course, we've got the Bill Nye character, which is really interesting. Number one, given that his BAFTA win is one of the most interesting and, like, inspired wins in, like, at least the awards in the last 20 years from any awards body. And the thing here, what's interesting, is how he's able to make basically one of, if not the most memorable character in the movie, when he's basically a background character. Like, we start with him, like he's the movie's opening scene and everything, but then once that's established, and he does like the radio interview and stuff like that, and the scenes with his manager, but for the most part, his performance is really just people watching him in the background or hearing him on the radio. And so he's sort of this constant presence, even if he's not fully there, like, up close and personal. But those scenes where he does, have dialogue, and we do get to see him, and how he interacts with other characters, and the way he views himself and his own career. Just really, it's those scenes where you really wish he was more prominent in the movie, but at the same time, it's like, maybe his screen time is just the perfect amount, actually, especially since, like I said, he's still in the background, even if it's just his music. And the way that we see him, because, like, obviously we see him the way he sees himself, where it's like he's this washed-up dude putting out crappy albums, and he's very much aware of this and is almost embracing it at this point. He's basically embracing his, like, shitty, almost ironic fan base at this point. But at the same time, he's like this sort of he's like this recurring moment in Liam Neeson's stepson's kid, where every time he sees him, he, like, gets inspired, and it's like he's this guy who views his career in this way and sees people this way, like, has the girls with the big tits in his videos, and he's talking about, don't buy drugs, just become a pop star and they'll give them to you for free. And it's like, this is the guy that's, like, giving this kid a sense of purpose in how he seeks out his love, which is this really interesting balance that actually ends up working, weirdly enough. But then you get those moments also where it's like, those moments where he is aware that he's like the cliche rock star that got washed up and all that, and his career is fizzling out, and even if this comeback feels like a cliche and it's for a product that he's not proud of at all, you get those scenes where there's like, I want to say a vulnerability, but it almost kind of seems like the opposite. Like he's as vulnerable as he's gonna get, particularly when he's talking to his manager at the end. But there's that way about him where he's like trying to maintain his cool nature while he does it. So he's like going as far into vulnerability as he possibly will, while also intentionally trying to not do that. And you can sort of see the struggle here as he delivers this dialogue to his manager, which makes it touching in this bizarrely funny way. So I always love that character, and I love that performance. It's probably one of the best performances of his career. Maybe that's a pretty long list, but it's definitely up there, and definitely one of the ones that, you know, stands above it, at least in regards to how memorable it is. So, and obviously, being a romantic movie, it is going to be full of those scenes, that, like, just those memorably romantic scenes, whether it be the surprise that Andrew Lincoln gives at the wedding for Chiwetel Ejiofor and Keira Knightley, where everybody starts singing, you know, "All You Need Is Love" and stuff like that, and you have the scene with... Sometimes they're a lot smaller than that, like the scene when Laura Linney and Rodrigo Santoro are making out, and she excuses herself to go up the stairs, and there's the... It's basically cut in half by this stairway, and it's her celebrating this kiss while he's kind of unsure of what's happening. Just little moments like that are just as romantic as the big gestures, too. But then you have stuff like the Andrew Lincoln subplot with Keira Knightley, which even Andrew Lincoln himself has come out and said, you know, it comes off a bit weird and stalkery. And I think even Curtis was going for a little something there, because as romantic as it might seem to an extent, there is something knowing about this, particularly if you'll notice in the scene when Knightley finds the tape that he took at the wedding, that's pretty much she's mostly the focus of. There's a copy of Rear Window there, which obviously is about the bad places like a voyeuristic way can go. So it's like there is something knowing there about the questionable direction this guy takes his feelings for Keira Knightley. So, but they do something really interesting with her character here that sort of, I think, balances out a little bit. Because obviously, one of the most famous scenes in the movie that people are still continuously recreating in supposedly romantic gestures is the cards without saying anything, so Chiwetel doesn't know what's going on. Despite the fact that that's his best friend, obviously there's a number of things wrong with this. But the thing that really adds something to it is the way Knightley reacts to this. And some people might think that's also a problem. That maybe she's a little too... like, her reaction is maybe not the most... long story short, Chiwetel's getting the shit end of the stick here. And this is basically happening behind his back, but we do get a sense that it is ending once they sort of cap it off with him doing the card thing and her kissing him, but then that's, like, it. But, I mean, even so, there's something not quite right here, but the thing I've been building up to that I still haven't said yet, is her initial reaction really adds something to it that I think makes me not as, like, immediately dismissive of what's going on here. And how... Because I feel like the obvious cliche moment of this scene where she realizes how he filmed the wedding would be like, oh god, this is like, you are like such a fucking weirdo, and this is fucked up, and he's your best friend, and I'm his wife, and all that. And it's like, well, that's probably the way she should have reacted. It would have been a scene that we saw coming from a mile away, and probably would have made that storyline go in this boring direction. But that reaction that she has, where the very first thing she says is like, but why don't you talk to me? And it's like this really sort of heartbreaking thing where she's trying to, like, it's almost like the reason she doesn't react in a big way is because it's just such a sort of mindfuck to her that this dude that just seems so passive-aggressive towards her this whole time and resentful of her because of coming between his friendship with him and Chiwetel, apparently. And this is what's actually going on. It's just like this, she's just trying to fathom how it's possible. And the fact that there is something that there obviously is something that touches her about the fact that he does feel that way, given the way he was initially putting it off as, but... so yeah, I do think that adds another layer to it, and it makes it a little less easy to dismiss as just Andrew Lincoln's a total creeper, but yeah, still, when you look at it from Chiwetel Ejiofor's perspective, you might have a lot more questions about how you're supposed to take that. But still, you know, there's a little something there. There is also some portions that are like stories where we're not totally sure if we need them or not. I don't know that the Colin Firth story has really enough here. Like, I can see where it might work. It almost seems like one of those, you know, like, small indie romance movies you would have seen in, like, the mid-90s that just come and go, that would have had, like, Vanessa Redgrave in it or something, in a supporting role. But it's like the whole thing when they have to go into the water for his book and all that, and the whole language barrier thing, like, it feels like there's a nice story here, but I mean, in the long run with everything else, it's just kind of like, I don't know. And by the time we get to them at the end, when they have to do the whole, you know, Cyrano-like moment where they're being translated, and it's like, by then it just sort of feels like it's being dragged on a little bit, but there is something there. It does seem it does seem like there's some territory we're not exploring, like why his wife or girlfriend, whoever she is, was cheating on him, and where all that was stemming from. It's like they're just immediately go from that story being one thing to being another, like, almost instantaneously with no in-between. And of course, not an actor named Colin now, but a character named Colin, the waiter that decides he's going to go to America for the American girls in bars that love British accents. And I can kind of see... I've heard an argument that the scene is basically Curtis, like, basically taking a jab at the simplicity of, like, the American approach to this sort of thing. And I do kind of see where that might be coming from, if that's the case. But I do, and you could maybe say something about how it's... how much American romantic comedies are, like, solely revolve around, like, the sexuality aspect. It's like... The characters only change or only have something significant happen to them after they've banged or whatever, when they're getting ready to or whatever. But I do feel like this is sort of a one-joke idea that feels like it's going in, like, you know, some direction. Like, the way they keep building it up, like it's going to be some payoff, and every time we cut back to him, and now he's really building up this trip to America, and then it's, like, all pays off in, like, one scene that's in the middle of the movie. It just sort of feels like we sort of reached like, it felt like we were building to something, and it's like, no, it's just gonna go in the obvious direction, and that's pretty much it. And it's like, the only real payoff is that there's two cameos with Shannon Elizabeth and Denise Richards. And it's like, that just, and once again, when you look at in the long run with the rest of the movie, some of this stuff could probably be cut out, or at least, you know, spread out a little bit to where there's a bit more to it. Like I said, maybe with that one theory, maybe it's intentionally, you know, simplistic to, you know, talk about the American way or whatever, but I don't know. I just feel like it's a little pointless in the long run. So, and it says, like, it could be a funny joke that it is exactly how it plays out how he thinks it's going to, but the way they just kind of make it go on, and once again, I know that could be part of the joke, that it keeps building on itself, where another, like, Alicia Cuthbert comes in and so on, and like, they just keep building onto it, but nevertheless, it still just feels like one joke that's just a whole lot of build-up for a payoff that we know is coming. So I don't know. I've never really... I always felt like that could probably be cut out, especially when you look at the full length of the movie. So yeah, so as far as, like, the main points, I don't know if I skipped over anything, or if I did, it's probably not that worth talking about, but you've got, like, because, I mean, sometimes, another thing I was going to go on in regards to that simplistic way was, you do have moments like that where obviously the movie's going to use sexuality, but there's cases like, the scene where, Rickman's co-worker, I think her name is Mia, where we have the scene where they're... Rickman and Thompson are at home, and they're getting in bed and all that, and it's already been established how he feels about her and all that, and there's just one scene that seems so superfluous in the long run, of Mia, like, going home and undressing to her underwear, and then that's it. That's, like, the whole scene. It's a scene by itself. And you think, well, that might seem kind of pointless, but it is one of those things where you kind of think about it, and it's like, is it, you know... in that whole direction we were talking about with Colin, is it this thing where it's, like, this sort of contrasting thing to where it's like it's showing the temptation, like this is what Rickman could have, but he's got Emma Thompson, and that's not to say anything bad about Emma Thompson. It's to my understanding they made her like some sort of like mild fat suit or something to make her look more like out of shape. So so I'm going to assume it was sort of something like that. So even then, with little cuts like that, there's a little something there that it might seem like on the surface, where like if an American romantic comedy, a shitty, okay, there obviously are good romantic comedies. Like if it were a shitty, like a shitty cliche romantic comedy, it would be like if there was a shot of a character like me adjusting her underwear and all that, there would be no purpose to it. It would just be for the sake of that. But here you sort of feel like it's that sort of showing off, Rickman's temptation and the contrast to a character like Emma Thompson and all that. So yeah, stuff like that is in there. There's also the Martin Freeman Just Judy thing going on, the porn actors. I do feel like that's something that could work because they have such charming chemistry together, and and it has a nice little send off to them the last time we see them. But they're in it so little, and they seem to connect to so little that they just feel like an afterthought. As nice as it is when they are there. So that I feel like maybe they could have done a bit more with, and I feel like I think Joanna Page is the actress's name, her and Freeman could have easily done more with that if given more. So yeah, but obviously, like I said, we've got all this stuff about how they connect is done quite well. There's even some moments where it's like they use certain musical transitions that are really nice, like how the song that plays at Liam Neeson's wife's funeral goes right into that song playing at the reception Chiwetel and Keira Knightley's wedding. And then there's like the scene where Billy Mack is playing on the radio. I think it's in Rickman's office. And then how that goes into his radio interview where it was playing from. So like little transitions like that while we're bouncing around so much really add a nice little detail to it also. And like I said, even with all this, all the romantic stuff, it is nice that we also have little moments that don't even really pertain to that, but are just nice moments in themselves. Like Hugh Grant dancing around is like its own whole thing. And then there is the Rowan Atkinson wrapping the gift and taking forever to do so. Well, I do think that's just a good comedic scene that stands by itself. Apparently, there was obviously that thing where Curtis was saying that the original idea was that Rowan Atkinson was an angel throughout the movie that was like, basically there, like when he's there, he was like prolonging Rickman getting that necklace, so when he didn't get it right away, that kept him from getting it to Maya, thus making his marriage, not breaking his marriage just yet. He was there to prolong it as much as he could. And then the same thing in the airport, where it's apparently in the airport he was like supposed to disappear after he talked to Liam Neeson to really show that whole supernatural quality to his character off. But I think they ultimately just decided to make him just a dude that pops up occasionally a couple of times. But it is, when you look back on it, it is interesting to see that. But I think the rapping scene, even without a connotation like that, just kind of works by itself. It's just this little comedic moment for an actor that's just so brilliant with physical comedy, just to do this one thing. So yeah, so overall, obviously it doesn't 100% work. I think a couple of these stories could be, trimmed down or cut altogether, and some of them could have a bit more meat to them, but overall, it is easy to see how it's like this movie that is still discussed and still tradition around this time of year, and has inspired so many people to make, big romantic gestures and all that. So yeah, and it definitely stands out when you look at Curtis's filmography of like Four Weddings and Bridget Jones and Notting Hill, and it's like just these almost instant classic romantic comedies, and this one was just yet another one for him. So and probably one of his better ones also. Like Notting Hill was something I was never crazy about, but I do appreciate it for like what it is and how it sort of stands out in the romantic comedy genre and all that. But yeah, so long story short, I do like it's one of those movies definitely where you have to see it multiple times, I think, before you really fall in love with it, because there is so much going on and there's so many characters, and you sometimes may not fully grasp what's always happening in some of them because so much is going on you have to keep up with. But once you really get to know it inside out, it just really grows on you, like I said, just becoming a tradition at this point. So now we can go on to, it's obviously not Christmas related, but like I said, the intersecting stories, where we have Playing by Heart, by a writer-director named Willard Carroll, who is a name I don't fully recognize. I think the only The only thing I really recognized to his credits right before he did this, he had like writing credits on the Brave Little Toaster direct-to-video sequels. And it's a weird filmography when you look it up. A lot of the stuff I haven't heard of, but I did hear about this, and this was one that I actually saw in pieces a lot on movie channels before I saw it in full, and which really, with this style, is not a not so inappropriate way to see it for the first time, as long as the reveals don't happen to you too quickly. But the thing about this, though, is that once again we got a lot of characters. Like this massive cast list you see here, like isn't even everybody. So what you have is it's gonna bounce around a lot. We start with Angelina Jolie's character, giving this monologue to a character off screen, which we'll figure out pretty quickly is Ryan Phillippe. And we do circle back around to that eventually and see the scene from another angle, but the thing here is that after she gives this big monologue, it introduces her character named Joan at the bottom, and then we get the title of the movie, and then we get the rest of those intros, which sounds like it might be a bit of a sloppy intro. For the most part, it does work. The main problem with the intro is that instead of being like Love Actually, where we just sort of gradually meet every character, they do give one each an intro with their names coming up on screen, which is, with a cast that's this big, is going to take some time. And you can tell that after a while they kind of started running out of that time, because it's like, with Joan we get a big monologue and all that, and then with like Dennis Quaid's character walking in and approaching Patricia Clarkson in a restaurant and dropping this bomb of information on her, even though she's a total stranger, and then the Jenna Rollins and Sean Connery story, it's like the way they set these up, like each story starts with a hook before we go on to the next intro, to where it's like, oh, what's going on with this person, because we've just got this one little hint of what's going on in their life or whatever, what's about to happen to them. But then like halfway through this, we just kind of start unceremoniously meeting the rest of the characters that don't have a hook. And it's sort of like they realize it, and so it's like, it sort of loses it sort of runs out of gas just in the character intros, which sounds like maybe a bad sign, but obviously the characters that we don't immediately get, real hooks or intros on will eventually progress into something more meaningful. So I say you might seem put off at first if the movie seems like it's maybe in too much of a hurry, but they do manage to. I think it helps a lot how recognizable the names in the cast are. Not just necessarily that recognizability it helps, but the fact that it's such a strong cast. Like even names like Jay Moore, Ryan Phillippe might stand out as people. It's like you don't think of them as like actors or anything, but they can definitely put something out there worthwhile if need be, if it calls for it. So I guess we just go from story to story, or at least the important stuff, kind of like we did with Love Actually. So the story that's always stood out to me, even like you would think, growing into this movie that your perspective might change for a while. I mean, sure, once you're like much older, it might be easier to see this, like the Jenna Rollins Connery story to stand out as the heart of the movie, but the one that's always stood out to me from when I saw this in youth to now is still the Angelina Jolie Ryan Phillippe story. And I don't know if the director was kind of going for that too, since her character's monologue is the start of it before we get the title. And it's something that we're sort of waiting to circle back around to, but the thing that this might be, and once again this is a long list, but this might be one of my favorite of Angelina Jolie's performances, mainly because of there's really kind of a complex thing she has to do here, because when we meet her, she's obviously she has this monologue, this philosophical thing going on, but then when we see her the rest of the time, she's in the middle of this really bad breakup, and she's on these, loud phone calls and all that, and she's basically set up as this really abrasive person, especially the way she goes after Phillippe, who really doesn't say much, but she basically forces herself into his life, or forces him into her life, and she feels like such a real person, in the sense that when you see this character, there's something that seems so off-putting about her because of how abrasive she is, but at the same time there's something so appealing about her, to where we feel like we're right there with Phillippe's character, to where it's like, half of me wants to get as far away from her as possible, but half of me just can't walk away. And the way that she's able to do both of that at the same time just really helps, and then those moments where it's like, And like I said, even sometimes where it's almost like there should be a divide here, like they're like it's aggressively trying to put a divide between them. Yet the way they keep coming back together somehow feels natural and real. One scene that always stood out to me was their first date, which is not a date, but basically a date. Depends on which one of them you ask. Is to meet up at a theater and see Texas Chainsaw. And it's like, I think about the ending of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then I see them walking out of the theater silently, smiling, and they go down the escalator, and they're just walking like they're on a date. And it's like, it's so weird to imagine that they just saw the end of Texas Chainsaw, and this is how they are right now. It feels like they should be a bit more jarred or something, but even so, apart from something like that, their relationship still does feel very, like, because obviously there's a bit of a self-destructive thing here, because like self-destructive sort of from our perspective, and thus Philippe's also, to where it's like that whole sense of we feel like, you know, maybe we should get away from her, but there's just something about her that keeps bringing us back, which could be seen as self-destructive. But then it's also the same thing with her, where it's about him, where it's she like flat out tells her sister on the phone, like he's a man of few words, but when he does speak, he just knows how to crush my soul with those few words. But there's just something completely drawing her to him as well. But the really interesting thing they do with this is they don't make him, like, when you think about that kind of scenario, you imagine that he's going to be like a bad boy type, like a type that maybe she should avoid and not the other way around, particularly with his blue hair. But it's just interesting because you know that it wasn't written that way, because if you read up on it, apparently Phillippe showed up on the set the first day of filming with the blue hair and didn't tell anybody he was going to go with that. He just showed up that way, and the director was like, it works, let's do it. I think Jolie did something similar with the red hair too, so it's like he's really not like that traditional bad boy type that this sort of story and this sort of relationship usually sets up, which is really interesting. It throws an interesting wrench into that idea. And it's really just two people that, like, one really wants this to happen and the other is too distant, and we learn, you know, the reasons why later, and it's not necessarily the typical, oh, somebody broke my heart, the end, and there is definitely something deeper between these characters, especially since they're the kind of characters where you look at what they look like and your initial response is probably, especially with the place they hang out to, the clubs and shit, you sort of think you have a sense of them, but then as the movie goes on and they become significantly more real, like I said, it becomes so easy to see her character through Phillippe's perspective. It's crazy how they pull that off. His performance helps too. Like, it may seem that he's a bit sort of like dead in the face a little bit throughout the movie, but once things are revealed, like, the performance makes perfect sense. And I was talking about the scene where it comes full circle, where she has her monologue at the beginning about it's like dancing about architecture thing, which was the original title of the movie, which is interesting, but I think this one flows off the tongue a little better. But the way we see her monologue entirely looking at her in the opening scene, and then when we see it again later in the movie, we're cutting back to him, and we're playing off of his reaction to hearing her say it. And like I said, even if it seems like he might be dead in the eyes a little bit, there is something here that kind of makes the monologue resonate even more, seeing it now that we know his character and the stuff that we learn about him later. It sort of does make the scene different. Like, it might seem redundant in a worse movie to play that scene and then basically play that scene again in the middle of the movie, but just with the cuts to him inserted, it's surprising how much this tone of it sort of changes a little bit. So yeah, and then they add little things to his character about just these things that make him, like, really likable and trustworthy, like the way that he consistently brings up things in her life, because the thing about her character is she talks and talks and talks constantly, and he doesn't at all. And we think that he's just really not caring, or he's brushing her off or whatever. But then, and not just later when he has this big monologue about, you know, I've been trying to get you out of my head, but I just can't. I've been trying to not succumb to you, but I just have to now. So it's like he's always cared about everything she said, but there's hints of that throughout the entire movie, because there will be things in these really winded monologues that she has, and there just every now and then there's a little thing that she says that he'll bring back later to show you that he hears her when she's talking at all times, even if she never shuts up, and he even tells her to her face she never shuts up. But then those little moments throughout just show you that he's always listening, and it's this really, I said, it's really the best aspect of the movie is their relationship. So as, like, self-destructive as it might seem on the surface, it's actually, like, really sweet and really heartfelt at the center of it, especially when it gets to the whole end of it. So the rest of the movie has to compete with that, which is not always going to be there. We do have stuff like the Connery General Rollins story, which feels a bit minor in comparison. There's not as much drama, mainly because it feels confined to one location, just basically their house, as they're preparing for their 40th anniversary, and they're going to have like the renewed vows and all that. But then there's the whole thing, like there's a couple of problems here. One is him being diagnosed with a brain tumor, and the other is that he had an affair like 25 years ago that's resurfacing. Not that the affair is resurfacing and he's being, unfaithful again, but just the facts of this affair are resurfacing, and they're having to discuss that all over again and confront that. And obviously there's something here between the two of them. I know, I was reading that the interesting thing about this is this seems like kind of an odd role for Connery. But the thing is he was like so into taking this role where it's like not only would he get to have play a character his own age, but also have a relationship with a character in his same age group with an actress like Jenna Rollins, and he wanted that so badly that he only took $60,000 to make this movie. And if it's like, yeah, $60,000, the year before this he had done The Rock, where they gave him $14 million. And it's like he went all the way down to 60,000 because that's how badly he wanted this part. I think that in itself says, and his desire to play a role like this is definitely in his performance, especially between the two of them. And obviously, it's just these scenes are just kind of, even when they're not doing the drama, it's just full of those little moments, like him acting like a dog or all that, or they'll. One of the first scenes when he's watching Leno and he's like, we know there's something dramatic between them. But when he's watching Leno, he turns to her and he says, I've started watching Leno instead of Letterman, can this marriage be saved? And stuff like that just really works and makes them feel real also. They're another one where we probably could have had more focus on them. It probably would have, I'm sure they could have made a lot more that would resonate than what's here. But I think that just has to do with the short amount of screen time it feels like they have in comparison to the rest of the movie. But then you have, like, very odd sort of additions in here, like the Dennis Quaid character, where he has a very strong scene in this opening where he just walks out from the rain and, like I said, approaches a complete stranger, Patricia Clarkson, and tells this whole story about how, 3 days ago I was supposed to meet my wife and kid at Pizza Hut, and they were somewhere else and then I was somewhere else, and I was just going to stop at the bar, I was going to get a few drinks, and I was just a little buzzed, and I was driving to meet them, and then I crashed, and the people in the other car were killed. And of course it turns out the people in the other car that were killed were his wife and son. And you're like, holy shit. And it's like, and the way he plays this is like so, like, it's like he was making an Oscar clip here. And then it happens again in another scene, and he's a totally different person. And your first thought is, oh, okay, this dude is just an absolute sociopath that goes around and recreates these own backstories for himself to see how people react to him. Until we eventually find out it's an acting exercise. Which, once again, assuming the Patricia Clarkson characters or the Natasha Kinski characters are not aware of this, it's like there's still something a little sociopathic about that, but still, it does make for an interesting character, and the way he... Like, this is something that sort of feels a bit off with the rest of the movie, but especially since most of them are so romance-driven, every now and then you've got a story like his... or a story like Ellen Burstyn and Jay Moore, where Jay Moore's dying of AIDS and Ellen Burstyn's his mom and all that, and they're, going through family history and his whole deal and all that, how he hid, like, his gay life from her and all that, but still, there is something about these, and the way they connect may be a bit underwhelming since they seem so off the map from everything else, but they are interesting as sort of standalone things, which is probably probably the least we can ask for, so the fact that they were able to do that, like I said, having this all-star cast that fits so well probably helps a lot, too. But then we have this story with Gillian Anderson and Jon Stewart, where they just meet by chance in this building, and they decide to just go out on a date. And obviously she's been through a lot. We obviously learn later why that is, but it's like... It actually, the movie spends so much time on this. Like, we talked about the Jolie Phillippe story, but... in the first half of this movie, they spend so much time on the Gillian Anderson, Jon Stewart stuff. It's almost like you get the idea that the director almost wanted to make this like a whole movie by itself, like he could have if he wanted to. And this just this really sweet story about how she's just so neurotic and has so much going on in her life, and she's been really put through the emotional ringer. So going into another relationship is this really big frantic thing for her, and Stewart is just this really really patient dude that is just ready for any sort of manic things she'll bring into his life, because we do get a sense that he knows where she's coming from and that he's willing to prepare himself to just take her as she is regardless of what she's been through. And there is something really nice about it, but there is like cases where it's like it does sometimes the distribution of the stories in this movie is a little off, where it's like there'll be times when we spend time with the Gillian Anderson, Jon Stewart characters, then we'll cut back to something, and then we cut right back to them after only cutting to one other thing. And it's like it feels like it should be bouncing around more with all the different stories we have here. So it's like I said, it's almost like he got a little too caught up in this story a little bit. But then, interestingly enough, they're in it much less the second half. So it's like, and then we get a lot more into the Jolie Philippi story. So it's like it does feel like, as much as it's jumping around, the distribution could have been more. And that's one of those things I've always wondered with movies like this. I know when I do like my own writing of stuff like this, it tends to be like I'm very like specific about what order it's in, and I've always wondered exactly if it's just the individual writer and director, where it's like if this was like a really specific order he had in the script, or if this was all the editing stage afterwards, in regards to the distribution of the stories here. But or if maybe there's a possibility that they were all written individually and then spliced together. It's really hard. I assume there's a number of methods you could do a movie like this, and I'm not sure what exactly approach really any director's ever taken to this. I've never really looked into it, but so apart from that though, and that can be a bit something that sort of throws you off a little bit, and maybe some things maybe don't hit as hard if it wasn't for like sometimes they do come together really nicely. Like another story that we have going on is the story with Madeline Stowe and Anthony Edwards having this secret affair. And there was the moment where, like, I've been saying that Ryan Phillippe's character has been kind of, standing back about what's up with him and what his backstory is. So we get these back-to-back scenes when, obviously the whole idea with Stowe and Edwards' affair is that they're not going to bring any baggage in, they're not going to take any baggage out. It's going to solely take place in this hotel room. They're going to do what they need to do, and then they're going to part ways until they meet again. But then they finally decide to break down and start opening up to each other. And the scene of them opening up to each other is like back to back with the scene where Phillippe finally opens up to Jolie. And it's like stuff like that where I feel like is a bit more cohesive, and it really feels like the movie's going in a certain direction. If they had been able to kind of do more stuff like that, I think we would have... And especially with the Madeline Stowe, Anthony Edwards thing, it does feel like also that unevenness where it's like, when we do know what exactly is going on with them, like when Stowe explains this is what they do, no baggage in, no baggage out sort of thing, it's like we're basically just now getting to know what's up with them, whereas in like a couple of other stories, we've already gotten like a full movie's worth of information about those characters. And I do understand, maybe keeping some of it in the dark so that some of it can be revealed, gradually throughout, but it does feel like there's a bit of an unevenness in regards to what we know about some and not the others, and where exactly the reveals are. Sort of like when it's revealed so late that Dennis Quaid is Madeline Stowe's husband, where it's like one of those things where it's revealed so late, I can't tell if this is just us being given new information about the characters, or if it's like one of the movie's first big reveals. Like, you can't really tell, so you're not really sure how to take it. And obviously there's other things like that, like obviously once things start coming forward, it is one of those cases of I can't tell if we're supposed to know things right away or if we're waiting for bigger reveals. Like, for instance, obviously we mentioned that Jay Moore was leading this gay lifestyle that ended up leading to him and his partner getting AIDS, and now his partner's already died, and now he's getting ready to. And that's its own subplot we've been seeing. But then earlier in the movie, Gillian Anderson was confiding in Jon Stewart saying, my ex-boyfriend who I was really in love with ended up being gay, and that's why my heart's broken. And it's like, I don't know if it's because if you're not trying to get ahead of the movie, if you're just sort of taking the movie as it comes to you, it seems like one of those things that should be so obvious, but it doesn't really occur to you right away that her gay boyfriend was Jay Moore. And then the same thing with what was it? When, well, yeah, there's the Quaid Stowe thing also, but then towards the end also, sometimes it's also like they're toying with that a little bit, especially when we're getting the big reveals. It is interesting to just kind of be freely saying this 20 years after the movie came out. Yeah, exactly 20 years after the movie came out. Where apparently critics were like actually forbidden in the reviews to reveal like what was going on. Obviously, sometimes critics can just kind of go into it. Some critics sort of slip or whatever. But I guess the filmmakers like really cracked down to get critics to not reveal what where it was going and how they connected. So this really interesting direction where it's for the most part the characters are all part of the same family and they all come together for this 40th wedding anniversary for Connery and Rollins, and it's like, but sometimes they still find ways to toy with you a little bit, like when it's revealed early on when they or earlier on when they say after the whole affair business happened they conceived another child, which was JoJo, as Sean Connery calls her, and it's like, are we supposed to put together immediately that that's Joan because she's the only character with Joe in her name, I think. So once you see, like I said, I don't know if that's the reveal that it's Jolie or not, or if they're waiting for the reveal to be that, and it's just whether or not you put it together early or not. But they still find ways to toy with you, where it's like when Gillian Anderson shows up at the anniversary, and it's like, oh yeah, we were just talking about you and your sister, and then just as we're about to say, once we realize Anderson's also their daughter, we're like, oh yeah, her sister, Angelina, and then it's like, nope, it's Madeline Stowe, and then it's obviously revealed they're all three sisters is the thing here, so it's like, and like I said, it's the way it is where I'm not sure how sometimes we get clues a little early exactly where the big reveals are supposed to be and when it's supposed to hit, because we do have like we're already reaching conclusions. Like the Philippi Jolie story like comes to a conclusion with like 25 minutes to go, because they have so much to wrap up and then so much to reveal about who connects to who and all that. The cherry on top being Edwards being the priest that's remarrying them. So like, and that sort of feels like left open a little bit also, but for the most part it does come together in this really nice way. And like I said, even for its shortcomings, just the cast, like, really ran together. Like, this is one of those movies that really didn't waste. Because usually when you see cast lists this long, you think somebody's going to get the shit end of the stick here or there or whatever. Or, somebody's not going to reach their full potential or something. But the whole cast really is quite brilliant. Even stuff like, you know, as out of nowhere as, like, Jay Moore playing an AIDS patient in a very dramatic and tragic way. When you have so many other, you know, dramatic actors in here that aren't known for like comedy or being comedians, it really, but still surprisingly end up paying off in ways where it's effective enough to where it's not jarring in any way. I think the fact that he's playing off Ellen Burstyn probably isn't hurting either. So yeah, so I've always actually liked this a lot as far as movies like that go, significantly better than like the Gary Marshall movies and stuff like that. But I mean, obviously Love Actually is like the ultimate of these movies like this, and I don't know if that's going to be a tough thing to beat if anybody even wants to try. Like I said, obviously the Gary Marshall movies try and stuff like that, but it's like, it's going to take a lot of work to be Love Actually, let alone try to better it, which, if you're going to try, good luck with that. So, yeah, so that's going to be it for this. Going right into the next Blunt video, which Bill Nye is going to stick around for. So, and then next week we're going to do a Christmas theme one I've been meaning to do for a while, one that's a very old classic and a somewhat newer classic, meaning 90s. So the 90s and the 40s against each other. So, and then like a lot of crowded review videos finally. We're going to get a lot more than what we've been doing with just the 2 Netflix movies or whatever. So, yeah, so all that shit. So until then, that's it.